Hello everyone, my name is Mr. Mitchell if you don't know who I am, and in this video we're going to make a start on our first step study in the Russia and its Rulers course on Alexander II. In your Russia and its Rulers paper, you will be given the option of 3 25-mark questions, similar to the ones you have already practiced in lessons, and you will be asked out of those 3 to complete 2 of them. However, what some of you might have forgotten is there is also a depth study question worth 30 marks in your paper, and this will contain 2 interpretations, both from reputable historians, regarding a particular aspect of one of the depth studies. As a reminder, there are 3 depth studies that we will cover in the 2 years. These are Alexander II, the Provisional Government of 1917, and Nikita Khrushchev. And each of these depth studies contains 4 lines of inquiry that you will need to know in superb detail. I intend to do a video of each aspect of the Alexander II depth study for you to better understand it. Now you might be wondering why they are considered depth studies, and why we place so much emphasis on these questions and getting them right. Unlike the 25-mark questions, where you are given a choice of 2 out of 3, the depth study question has no such choice. You are given 2 interpretations on any of the 4 aspects for each of the 3 depth studies, and you are asked to evaluate both passages and explain which you think is more convincing. You need to make sure that you have the knowledge to answer any question that could come up, and that is what makes this so challenging. On the screen now is an example of an Alexander II depth study question from a past paper. You will see how you are given 2 lengthy interpretations from 2 different historians. Your job for this question is to deduce which you find more convincing about the topic at hand. For example, this question is focused on the Alexander II depth study, and is specifically looking at the impact of his domestic policies. Your job is to identify, using your contextual knowledge, and your contextual knowledge alone, which of these is the closest to your understanding of the impact of his domestic policies. You will need to identify convincing aspects of each interpretation and unconvincing aspects, and ultimately come to a decision on which one you find more convincing and why. For those of you who did your GCSEs Anglo-European, this is in essence no different to the 3rd question on the Germany 1890 to 1945 paper. It is also similar to that question in another way. For the 30 markers in the Russia and its Rulers paper, you absolutely must not use provenance as the basis of your answer. Comments such as, "one was written more recently and therefore is more accurate," or "interpretation A was written by a Russian historian and he would know more about it." Those kind of comments are entirely invalid and will receive no marks. Provenance is entirely irrelevant here, and contextual knowledge is what must be used to figure out which is more convincing and why. Because of this, your own knowledge must be exceptionally sharp on these topics, hence why we call them depth studies. The reason why I'm going to make these videos is because there is so much detail that must be understood, and understood well. Now that we've understood what our question is, and we've introduced it, we're going to get cracking with our first aspect of the Alexander II depth study, which focuses on the debate around why Alexander II actually implemented the reforms he did. More specifically, the title of this particular topic is "How far were Alexander II's reforms due to the Crimean War?" When Alexander II inherited the throne on the 2nd of March 1855, there was much less jubilation than one might expect. The previous Tsar, a man called Nicholas I, had died rather suddenly of pneumonia. Alexander also took control of the Russian Empire in one of its darkest times. The Crimean War, which had been going on for more than a year, saw countless Russian soldiers lose their lives in what was widely regarded both at home and abroad as a pointless and exhausting war against the alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. The Russians easily suffered more than 550,000 deaths in this conflict, most of them due to disease. Those that fought were rarely from urban centres, like Moscow or St. Petersburg, and for the most part were serfs that were directly drafted into the Russian army, often with only a week's worth of training and an antiquated firearm to use. Behind the lines, European Russia was in an even worse state. In 1855, the Cossacks of southern Ukraine rose in revolt, partly due to the policy of forced enlistment for the Crimean War. At their peak, more than 10,000 Cossacks actively fought against the government, and controlled an area of land the size of Wales. There were also student riots in major cities in 1862 that demanded the overthrow of the Tsar. A lack of Russian naval power meant the British were able to strike Russia across its vast landmass, including places like the Solovetsky Islands in the White Sea, St. Petersburg in the Baltic, and Vladivostok in the Far East. The fact that Russia was unable to defend its own territory showed the technological and economic backwardness of the country. It also struggled to get soldiers into the Crimea due to a lack of railways, something that Britain and France were decades ahead on. All of this forced Alexander to look for a speedy way out of the war, and in 1856 he signed the Treaty of Paris, ending the Crimean War for good. This war was a ghastly defeat for Russia, and it was humiliated on the world stage for being a backwards and weak country that was far behind the rest of Europe. Alexander introduced a number of key reforms during his early years of power, between 1856 and 1864. And these reforms would earn him the title from some, the Tsar Liberator. For many, he would be seen as a positive figure even up until today, with Russia, Ukraine, Finland and Bulgaria all having statues in their capitals, treating him as a heroic Tsar, one that brought Russia out of the darkness and into modernity. His main reforms centred around catching up with the West economically, socially and militarily, and all of his reforms can be linked back to this in some way. The debate about whether Alexander's reforms were because of the Crimean War is what we are going to focus on, and we will start with the arguments for that assertion. Some of the key reforms he introduced are as follows. Firstly, his most well-known reform is the emancipation of the serfs, abolishing serfdom in 1861. This allowed serfs to become free and independent people across the Russian Empire. Alexander theorized that because peasants were tied to rural lands, there was a lack of surplus population in cities and towns that could otherwise work in factories. By ending serfdom, peasants would be free to move around the country as they desired, and create the ideal urban conditions for a Russian industrial revolution, allowing Russia to catch up with the West economically. Another key reform of his was the idea of glasnost. Glasnost means openness in Russian. This saw Alexander II attempt to relax the authoritarian control his father had and allow more freedom within society. This comprised a number of smaller reforms, including the lifting of press restrictions, the permitting of universities to teach subjects such as philosophy, which had been banned under previous rules, and the ability for Russian citizens to move around the country without the need for an internal passport. This also included the introduction of the Zemstva in 1864, a system of local councils designed to adequately represent the rural peasantry and create a sense of political participation. Alexander II also tried to improve the military. He saw that the army was in a dire state after the Crimean War, and decreed that he would modernise the army to Western standards. With help from his Prussian allies, he gave them a new uniform, standardised their weaponry, and reduced the length of service in the army from 25 years down to 15 years, with 6 years in active service and 9 years as a reserve. He ensured they received training frequently, and also changed the method of conscription to ensure men were taken from all social classes, not just the serfs. While this reform didn't make overwhelming changes, it did improve the army's discipline and cohesion, as we would see in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877. Finally, Alexander II realised that the economy of Russia was lagging behind the West. As a mainly agrarian nation, so a nation that uses farms for a living, it had very little in terms of factories, infrastructure, or production machinery. This was reflected in the Crimean War, where there were no trains to get troops to the conflict zone, and their weaponry was of a poor quality. To illustrate this point further, the Crimean War cost 45% of all government expenditure in 1854, and this all showed Russia had to modernise and industrialise to improve its economy. Alexander II introduced strategic railways built to improve the transport of troops and provisions, such as the St. Petersburg to Warsaw railway line. By liberating the serfs, he also allowed factories to have more workers and expand production. There was also an effort to bring in foreign experts to start up enterprises, such as coal extraction under Mikhail von Reuter. While those were his main reforms, there is an argument that they weren't centred around the Crimean War, and actually can be attributed simply to the preservation of autocracy. This means that the reason Alexander II made reforms was simply to secure his own power. For example, the emancipation of the serfs can be seen as an attempt to appease the masses and prevent rebellion after the Crimean War. Nicholas I, Alexander's father, even he acknowledged the need for reform, when in 1842 he said, "There is no doubt that serfdom, in its present form, is a flagrant evil which everyone realises." Alexander II also saw serfdom as a threat to his power, stating famously that it is better to abolish serfdom from above rather than have it abolish itself from below. By this he meant that he would rather deal with serfdom himself and end it than have people rise up and end it for him, potentially ending the Tsardom as well. Most of the soldiers in the Crimean War were conscripted serfs, and this created a lot of resentment in the countryside. By ending serfdom, he prevented a popular uprising all across the country that could have forced him to give up his power as Tsar. Alexander II could also be seen as a liberal. He was surrounded by liberal ministers and family members who encouraged reform for the sake of change, such as the Milutin brothers, Mikhail von Reuter, his brother the Grand Duke Constantine, and his aunt, Grand Duchess Elena Pavlovna. He may have just made these changes because he wanted to make change, because he was a liberal. Once serfdom had gone, other reforms had to take place to create new institutions responsible for law and order, public health and education. This was because the nobility had been those who were responsible, and when serfdom ended, so did the system of nobility pretty much as well. This saw the introduction of trial by jury and the creation of the Zemstva, both moves towards westernizing and towards a more liberal society. A good argument for Alexander II being more liberal can be seen in the fact that he wanted education to be extended. If Russia was to compete against the modern industrial states of Britain, France and Germany, he would need an educated workforce. But he would also want to see people educated out of his own good. There is a common debate about whether Alexander II's reforms truly were influenced by the loss of the Crimean War, or whether it was for the maintenance of his own power. Some historians believe he was genuinely liberal, and that his nickname of Tsar Liberator was well earned. Some historians believe that he was just simply trying to maintain his own power. It is entirely up to you what you think on this issue, but do not forget why we are doing this. A vital knowledge of why Alexander II made these reforms is necessary for a 30-mark question that concerns their origins. The relevance of all this information we have just discussed links back to the two interpretations given in a 30-mark question. It is up to you to use knowledge like this to test each interpretation for convincingness, looking for instances where your knowledge agrees with what the interpretation is saying, as well as examples of where the interpretations are less convincing. We will be practicing these kind of questions frequently, so don't panic if you don't entirely understand just yet. I appreciate this video hasn't been particularly well structured, but depth studies are the most complicated lessons of the entire course to teach, so give me a little bit of slack. Do not forget that if you are unsure about anything, this video will always be available to listen to as many times as you need, or until you get fed up with my voice. Thank you very much for listening.